It broke my heart, man. It's like, and not just for me, but for Chantelle. To me, no one's honouring her.
Terri Friesen was just 21 when in November 1989, she was convicted of manslaughter. She'd confessed to police that she had shaken her baby Chantelle to stop her crying. But Terri has long maintained this was a false confession.
Why did you make that false confession?
To save my daughter's life.
Terri is referring to her eldest daughter, Rebecca, who was around 3 at the time of Chantelle's death. Suspicion fell on both Terri and her then partner, Brownie Broughton. Interviewed separately for hours, Terri says detectives threatened that if neither of them confessed, Rebecca would be taken into care.
You know, back in those days, we all knew what was going on there. We'd be lucky if she got out alive.
Terri says the police also suggested her partner Brownie could well be in danger if he was convicted.
If Brownie admits to this charge, he's going to prison and he will die. He will get killed for that. No one has a baby killer.
Terri says Brownie had actually told her the night after Chantelle died that he'd caused her death by shaking her.
When he told me that, I'm like, oh, don't be stupid. You know, it was cot death. That's just ridiculous.
That was until she walked into the police station and the detective conducted a demonstration.
The first thing he does is have this little baby doll and he picks it up as I'm sitting down and goes, this is how your daughter died, and shook the shit out of it. And when he said that, I just like, oh man, I was like, whoa.
Terri says as the hours ticked by and Brownie failed to confess, she did, to protect her remaining daughter Rebecca from being taken away. Terri was charged and convicted of manslaughter and spent 6 weeks on remand in Mount Eden prison, followed by 6 months supervision. Just over a year later, in 1991, Brownie went to the police in New Plymouth and told them that it was he who killed Chantelle. The police did nothing.
He came back that night and he ended up giving me a hiding because he said, no, you go home, Brownie. We got the right one. We know it was Terri. And so he's like, so it was you, and started beating me up.
In 2002, Brownie confessed for a second time. This time the police believed him. He was charged and convicted of manslaughter. In the sentencing notes for his conviction, Judge Chambers said,
Chantelle's mother, in fact, had nothing to do with Chantelle's death. You caused Chantelle's death. It was you who shook her in such a manner as to cause her death. You stood by and let her confess to a crime which she had not committed.
But Terri's conviction remained on her record. In 2017, Terri was contacted by law student Kelly Phillips, fired up after having seen Terri on an episode of the TV series I Am Innocent.
This is my story.
The social stigma of being a single mother and a woman trying to do things on your own really spoke to me. And it was just such a blatant injustice what happened to her.
Kelly reached out to investigator Tim McKinnell. They assembled a legal team, and 2 years later, the Court of Appeal made its decision.
Kia ora, good evening. A Taranaki mother has been cleared of killing her baby nearly 30 years after she was convicted.
Terri Friesen listened to the Court of Appeal recount the events that led to the death of her 7-week-old baby Chantelle before quashing Friesen's conviction for manslaughter.
Her team were jubilant, but they weren't finished.
When you have been sent to prison and labelled a baby killer for more than 2 decades, money doesn't fix it. It doesn't change the damage and the challenges that Terri has had to put up with for a very long time. But from Terri's perspective, she's interested in both compensation and an apology, that she was wrongfully convicted for killing her own baby and had to live with that stigma for a very long time.
Tim had previously helped Taina Porter get compensation. Taina spent 20 years in prison for a rape and murder he did not commit.
Some people would assume that if a guilty conviction is quashed, it might mean you're innocent.
Because guilt is defined by proof beyond a reasonable doubt, Innocence is defined by the existence of a reasonable doubt. So the mere fact that a court of appeal, for instance, quashes a conviction does not necessarily mean that the court has found that the person is innocent.
Lawyer Jeremy Sutton successfully won compensation for Tyson Redman. He was wrongfully convicted for wounding and injuring in 2007. Jeremy explains the steps that determine eligibility.
You need to still be alive, you need to serve your sentence, and that sentence needs to have been revoked. The second step is, on the balance of probabilities, you're innocent of that crime. Our terminology is 51 to 49. More likely than not, you haven't committed that crime. And then the third step is it needs to be in the interest of justice.
Innocent until proven guilty, conviction for guilt quashed, and then you have to prove you're innocent. So how long does that whole process take?
Takes a long, long time. For me, in my case, it took 4.5 years.
Terri's team felt they had a good, strong case. They applied for compensation in December 2018. But 6 months later, the former Justice Minister Andrew Little declined the application. Terri's team pushed back and requested a review of that decision. Again, it was declined, this time by the current Minister for Justice, Kris Faafoi. Terri, how did you feel when you heard news that your claim for compensation was rejected by the government?
Disappointed and pretty heartbroken because of the reasons why.
Minister Faafoi said while Terri's claim was technically eligible for compensation, he pointed to evidence given by Terri's neighbours at her trial, suggesting on the night of Chantelle's death they heard the baby crying, Terri yell loudly, a bang and then silence, and that this matched up with evidence from the pathologist.
The evidence does not establish Ms Friesen's innocence on the balance of probabilities. If anything, it appears more consistent with Ms Friesen's guilt than innocence, or it is at least a 50-50 proposition.
As of 2020, only 8 applications for compensation for wrongful convictions have been paid out. 27 have been rejected. Any decision is up to the Minister of Justice and must be signed off by Cabinet. An application is made on paper and the applicant must prove their innocence on the balance of probabilities. The Ministry of Justice was not satisfied Terri Friesen had adequately proven her innocence in her compensation application. But Terri's team disagreed.
We felt on Terri's behalf, and Terri felt that she was in a really strong position. The officer in charge of the case that prosecuted the actual offender was of a view that Terri was innocent. The High Court judge that sentenced the actual offender was very clear in his judgment that Terri was innocent. The Court of Appeal quashed Terri's convictions and ordered no retrial. I'm not sure how much more legally innocent you can get in this country.
Well, the Minister's letter has suggested that because the neighbours heard her yelling at the child and heard the bangs, therefore silence that followed showed that she'd attacked the child in some way. That's an inference beyond the evidence, because the pathologist at the trial said that the fatal injuries occurred from the shaking of the child without impact. So what have the bangs got to do with anything? Nothing, really. It has nothing to do with the cause of death.
If swearing at or near your child is equivalent to killing them, then I'm a serial killer, right? I mean, it's this idea that she was a bad mother. And so even that, it's rearing its ugly head in the compensation decision. And it's like, well, okay, you didn't kill her by violently shaking her to death, but, you were kind of a bad mom anyway.
Even if Terri had been able to prove her innocence, Justice Minister Faafoi said compensation would not be in the interests of justice for 2 reasons.
First, there is the issue of Ms Friesen's false confession, wanting to protect her husband from prison, and daughter from state care explain why she falsely confessed, but does not excuse it. Intentionally lying to the police and the court perverts the course of justice.
People making false confessions all the time, so that can't preclude an award of compensation.
What we've begun to understand over the last 20 or 30 years since we've had DNA is that people quite regularly will confess to crimes they haven't committed for all sorts of reasons.
Terri's team argued her false confession was mainly due to the abuse she suffered at the hands of her partner Brownie.
I wasn't allowed to see my family. They weren't allowed to see me. Or anyone. I couldn't have any friends. Got to the stage I couldn't even go to the dairy, go shopping. Just kept away from everyone for years.
So he was very controlling?
Yeah, oh my God, yes. Mum used to go to New Plymouth all the time, park up down the street, hoping to see us come past.
According to Terri and some others who were close to her at the time, Brownie was also abusive towards 3-year-old Rebecca.
Probably not much longer after Terri was getting beaten up did I hear that he was being like that with Becca.
I never trusted Brownie with her, so that was another factor because he was violent towards her.
Law professor Julia Tolmie is an expert in intimate partner violence. She says this helps explain why Terri made that false confession.
Intimate partner violence is an attack on the victim's personhood. It's an attempt to undermine her autonomy and close down her space for action. It's not uncommon for victims of intimate partner violence to actually put their hand up and take responsibility for offending that their partner has actually committed.
Julia also strongly disagrees that Terri's false confession perverted the course of justice.
This is a case where the police were essentially alerted to the fact that they were dealing with serious family violence. They had a dead child. So an appropriate safety response by the police might have been to think there may well be other victims here. The police in this case did the exact opposite. They actually coerced the adult victim by threatening the well-being of her surviving child in order to get her to make a confession that exonerated the abuser. I think what the case very powerfully illustrates is that when we have problematic responses from the very institutions that we would expect to respond to family violence, that compounds the abuse.
But Minister Faafoi says the false confession wasn't the only reason why Terri receiving compensation wouldn't be in the interests of justice.
Second, there are the non-fatal injuries suffered by Chantelle in the days leading up to her death, fractured ribs and minor brain bleed. The precise timing of these injuries and their cause cannot be determined 30 years later. However, the available evidence indicates that Mr. Broughton may have been away from home when one or both of these injuries occurred. It would not be in the interests of justice to compensate someone who may have injured a child in this manner.
Terri's lawyer, Philip Hamlin, disputes this.
There was a suggestion earlier that Brownie may not have been present at the time, but it's so indistinct, he may well have been present at the time. The previous injuries that are referred to by the pathologist could have been quite likely caused by Mr. Broughton himself. He admitted to causing the fatal injuries by shaking the child and also by earlier causing the child injury when he changed the nappies. That could have led to those earlier injuries, and it doesn't suggest one minute that Ms Friesen should be the person who has caused those injuries. Why does the minister suggest that Terri Friesen might have been? I don't understand that. That contradicts the evidence.
What do you make of Minister Faafoi's comment?
There was some suggestion that she may have played a lesser role, although of course she was not charged with that lesser role. So I can't help but think that might have a political overtone to it, that the government would be criticised if they gave compensation to someone in that situation.
Minister Faafoi declined our request for an interview, saying he did not see grounds to overturn his predecessor's decision. There's not much option left for those who have had their applications declined. Jeremy suspects many people may not realise they could be eligible for compensation. He also wonders whether the process itself is fair.
Do you think that it's worth considering a more independent way of assessing compensation claims than the one we've got?
I mean, right now, even when all the eligibility criteria are met, the government can still say no if they think it's not in the interest of justice or just out of their discretion. So you could remove the discretion, and presumably that would likely mean changing the decision maker, since the Minister of Justice is a political post. So you could establish some kind of independent compensation commission, and you could make their enabling legislation mandatory.
And where does this leave Terri Friesen?
Do you have a question for the Minister if he's watching?
Oh my God. I'd ask him for an apology first of all for Chantelle, because you're disrespecting my dead daughter by avoiding all the truth and the facts that have come up in the case. And also I think you should apologise to all the judges that have said that I'm innocent.